And welcome back. The Wellbeing in the Nation Network is a growing strategic network of organizations, communities, and federal agencies working together to advance intergenerational well-being as well as equity. The WIN Network hosted an interactive and engaging virtual series of events themed How Might We Sharpen Movement Strategy for Lasting Change. And joining us to share now more, we've got the founder of Wellbeing and Equity in the World and executive lead of the WIN Network, Dr. Somava Saha. And we thank you, Dr. Saha, for being with us, and good to have you.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
It's important for us to talk about change, right? And lasting change. I think that's one of the things that you really deal with. But for those that may not be so familiar, I want you to take the time and just let us know a little bit about the organization.
Yeah, so many people, hundreds of organizations are working to create the conditions for a better day to day. But what we realized is that a lot of the time, we just keep catching people after emergencies. We stay in response mode forever. So a few years ago, a number of us who were interested in how do we get out of this cycle of just solving the problems of the day only to what it takes to create the conditions for lasting change in a way that makes sure that everyone has what they need to thrive over generations, decided to come together and form a growing strategic network made up of anybody who wanted to join us in that effort. And what happened is the Wellbeing in the Nation network formed with everybody from major national organizations to local grassroots communities to people who are across federal agencies who said, we all want to work together to advance intergenerational well-being and equity. We know we need to take care of business today, but we also want to make sure that we're doing what we can do to create the future so that we're not in crisis mode and can, in fact, think about what it takes to go beyond helping people survive to helping people thrive.
Yeah. Well-being in Nation Network, in the Nation Network, the acronym is WIN, and that's really what you want to do. You want to see people do, right? You want to see people win.
Absolutely. I think that that was one of the best parts of the name. Everyone could get involved with this idea that they wanted to be part of a win network and one that was creating wins for everybody and not leaving people out.
Yeah. And when we talk about creating wins for everybody, there has to be something said by the way of, economic change. Right now, we know that the inequities exist. They exist in gender inequity, from rate of pay for women to being underpaid across. Some people, underemployed, you're employed, but you're underemployed. These are all challenges that people are facing. How can we best tackle some of these things in our present context right now?
I'm so glad that you mentioned that. So, while we believe in creating conditions for the long term, we say, well, what can we do today that creates those conditions for the long term? So, part of what we said is, first of all, why is it that so many people, that in the wealthiest country in the world, 40% of children are growing up in poverty, and that number is growing even worse in the context of the pandemic. And what we saw was that there are these we call legacies for living together. It's our social contract with each other, where some people live in conditions where they're more likely to have what they need, and then there are others that are being driven by legacies of what we call trauma and exclusion, whether that's legacies of racism, gender exclusion, classism, and economic exclusion. That means that they're much more likely to end up in conditions of adversity, of harm, that to grow up in communities where they may be born in the same hospital as somebody else, but grow up just 2 miles apart with a 25-year difference in their life expectancy, in part because of the difference in their wealth, the difference in their well-being, and the difference in the community we call vital conditions. And so because of that, part of and what we saw then was it wasn't just that these legacies were in the past. In fact, we've built a whole economy that assumes people will remain in adversity. And part of what we need to do to shift that is to say, what would it take to create a well-being economy? What policies would help shift that? So we worked with hundreds of organizations and with local communities and people experiencing inequities to source a set of an equitable economies policy library that would say what would help shift the structure of the economy. What do businesses have to contribute? What do other groups have to contribute that would change the way in which we're set up to to have people in harm or not, to have an inclusive economy where everyone can contribute and thrive. And the second part of that is we began looking at bright spots. Who's already figured out a part of the solution to this? And so, in the recent convening we had for Win Week 2022, we hosted a session about bright spots toward building an equitable economy that had people like Dr. Lina Ravithran Green, who had founder of Angels of Impact, that who'd been working with Indigenous and women of color entrepreneurs, helping them to across the world, both applying principles of a restorative economy, grown from other that we've learned from other cultures about what it means to have an economy which gives back to the earth and to the people, but also really building the pathways of access to capital for Black Indigenous women entrepreneurs, and seeing that as they did that, as these women, often each entrepreneur had thousands of other women around them who could be employed. What they found was that when you invested in women entrepreneurship and gave women the capital they needed to really build what they did, that they reinvested back into their communities. They that multiplied. And there was a recent Nobel Prize at MIT that proved that actually that kind of local investment, it helps restore wealth in communities. And that's just one example of many that we could describe. That's about shifting the money we already have in a way that understands that if the problems we're in are coming from legacies of exclusion, we can choose uh, to be people who are creating legacies of inclusion by changing the way in which we use our operating dollars so that we are investing in communities that have been harmed through purchasing, through hiring, through investing differently. So not
Yeah.
more money, but just using our money better.
And sometimes it's a need to just reinvest, right? And reinvest in a better way that we can really solve some of the problems that we're having right now. But we have to really have a huge departure from some of the things that we're doing in order to do that. And having that conversation sometimes is not always the easiest conversation. So I'm going to take myself behind the scenes with you for a moment and just get your perspective on when these conversations are being had. What's the reaction? Because in circles that I've seen and circles that I've been in, as soon as something talks about redirecting power and wealth and redirecting opportunity, you can expect to see and experience resistance right away.
I think there are several ways in which we have gotten past that in our work in WIN. Um, so the first is about reframing this from a zero sum game to one where we have common cause. So if you actually look at the math, we can no longer afford to keep people in adversity. Just healthcare costs alone will grow to be 100% of the economy if we don't do something about it. And a huge amount of that comes from untreated poverty and structural racism. So there's actually a win-win-win in not harming people, in actually making sure our fellow brothers and sisters and people in the country have what they need to thrive, and that actually unleashes contribution. A second part is often people see this as a zero sum game instead of a pathway for mutual abundance, and that's a lot of what we begin to help people see and understand. A third part is understanding that there are things you can do. What I always say is, why should my money? I lead an organization, but so I think about every dollar in terms of not just how is it being used for the thing that it needs to do, but how can it be? How can I solve three problems at the same time? So how can it go three times more in terms of how it restores the imbalances in inequity, and that suddenly becomes not about finding new money or something like that. It's about taking the existing money that we were going to spend anyway, whether that was for hiring people, et cetera, and saying, how can we do better with that? But I think the last part of it is we as a country need to decide if we're going to uh, be a place that accepts just these vast extremes of wealth and poverty. We have our ratio between the CEO and the worker in this country is 625 to 1. In every other developed country, it's 25 to 1. No one is saying that everyone should make the same amount, that effort, et cetera, shouldn't count. But do we want to keep 40% of children growing up in poverty? That is actually so harmful that we'll pay for it afterwards in emergency room costs, in treatments, but it's the most ineffective way of doing that because we've harmed that entire person's life and we've paid for it after the fact. And it just doesn't make sense when you do the math. And what's lovely about it is if you flip your thinking around it, and that we have something to give, we can begin to restore. I think the last part of this is we have to acknowledge that this isn't just about individuals, that we founded this country on a foundation of structural and systemic racism, of privileging, let's be honest about it, white landowning men. And that advantage has lasted for a long time. And so if that structural advantage is something that we chose as a government to do, I think that some of that restoration has to be acknowledged from that basis. And we can begin to think about how we allocate resources in a way on the federal side to begin to think about how we build long-term pathways toward that bend the arc of justice.
I think there's a conversation that needs to be had because I think when we look at where we are in America, we have this high and haughty view of that we're doing it right. But when you look around the world, I think that you're absolutely right. You'll find out that there's so many things that we need to correct. There's so many things that we need to do. I was in Spain recently and watched people tell me about healthcare, that you got free healthcare, and that you don't have to worry about the surgery and this, that, and third. So many people who are burdened right now with medical debt, and you spend so much time trying to get out of medical debt that you've created this system of the haves and the have-nots. And when you look at what's going on right now in America, there is this huge difference and this huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots, and it continues to widen and it continues to get worse. And you talk about looking about communities of poverty. I live in presently right now a community where 90% of young people live in poverty. That's astounding. How does that happen in
In
a
the
place called
wealthiest country in the world.
right?
Well, and that's where I think we have lost our way as a nation. This is not about the vast majority of people losing out. It's about saying we don't have to have some people that are in top 0.1% making so much money while 40% of children, 90% of youth in your community are growing up in poverty. That means that we build a nation without a future because the trauma that those youth and kids will experience, that those families will have, will actually limit their understanding and potential for their future. It'll limit what they can contribute. It means we won't get the future scientists and doctors and construction geniuses and builders that get that because they've lost hope. And so we've grown to be a country where it's not 10% haves and 10% have nots. It's 1 to 0.1% haves and huge percent of everybody else in the have nots. So when 40% of kids are growing up in poverty, and 20% of families, and in communities of color, 40 to 50% can't afford $400 extra of an emergency expense, that's all of us. That's most of us, right? And so we have to begin to think, in a time when the middle class is shrinking, as costs for healthcare is going up, as inflation is going up, we have to have hard conversations about what we want this country to be about and whether everyone is going to continue to have the opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and the path to happiness. Because right now, we're not setting up the vast majority of this country to be able to do that.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, I want to have an opportunity to let our viewers know how they can get connected to you and the work that you're doing. How can they do that?
Well, I'm so glad you asked. If you go to the WIN network, so imagine you want to win, you want everyone to win, what WIN network, NETWORK.org, winnetwork.org. We would love to have you. We'd love to have you join the conversation.
Well, I'm glad that we had this conversation, and it's been great having you as a guest on, and we thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Sahava, and we look forward to talking again.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All righty. Well, thank you. Well, I want to let you know that we are taking a quick break, and guess what? We've got more coming up right after this.